The Celts were an ancient people who originated in the steppes of Russia, the Caucasus Mountains. They immigrated and migrated across Europe and went west. They were a nomadic people who placed a lot of importance on the value of hospitality. This is where I've derived the theory of Celtic joining and belonging, based on Celtic spirituality principles. In addition, the other origin of the theory comes from John O'Donoghue, an Irish priest who wrote about the Irish experience of joining and belonging. He poetically describes belonging as made up of two aspects, being and longing. Another reason for the development of this theory is that I felt there wasn't a language to describe how people join and belong to organizations. Let me take a minute to talk about the theory. Let me start by saying the theory is applicable to people's personal as well as professional lives. It concerns itself with how people join and belong to organizations. And there's different archetypes that people inhabit as they negotiate joining and belonging to organizations. However, these archetypes are fluid, and you can have one archetype in your private life and a different one in your public life. So let me go through the different archetypes to give you a sense of what the theory is like. These Celtic archetypes of joining and belonging are fluid and can change depending upon an individual's circumstances or life station. Let me talk to you about the archetypes now in more detail. The native has deep roots and is from an area and is loyal to an area. In contrast, a visitor is someone who visits an organization for a time-limited engagement. So, for example, someone who is a contract worker would be a visitor. In contrast, a wanderer is someone for whom freedom is more important than rootedness or belonging. And they will be in an organization for a limited amount of time, but it's more open-ended than with a visitor. And they tend not to put down roots in an organization. Well, let me say parenthetically that that's not always true, because a wanderer can become what we call a transplant, someone who puts down roots and decides to be part of an organization or a community. And so they transition. So the model is fluid. We also talk about the founder. The founder is someone who creates a new entity, like Steve Jobs would be the founder of Apple. The Pilgrims were the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the founder is an important archetype because they influence how other newcomers are welcomed in to the organization. Relating to that theme, the veterans are people who transition from being a transplant and put down more permanent roots. The interesting thing is that each organization has different ways of conferring that status of being a veteran. In an organization, one organization, it could mean that you have keys to the office. Another organization, a veteran status might be designated by a job title. In another organization, it could be conferred by status in terms of physical outlay, in terms of having a corner office. The neighbor is someone who lives in proximity to an institution and has an interest in it. The stranger is someone who shows up unexpectedly. They're the person that you don't expect to come for dinner. They could be the person who's reassigned to your organization unexpectedly. It's important to note that each one of these archetypes has a developmental task. Let me go over them quickly. The visitor's developmental task, is to be an ambassador for their country of origin while embracing the values of the new culture that they're visiting. The veteran's developmental task is to stay loyal to the organization, to the founder, while at the same time welcoming in and shepherding and mentoring people who come into the organization as visitors, as transplants, as wanderers, or strangers. A wanderer's developmental task is to be rooted and grounded in themselves, even though they're moving around physically from place to place or from job to job. And finally, the transplant is a former visitor, wanderer, or stranger, commits to belonging and being rooted to a place or organization from which they are not native. Let me give you an example of how this can play out in an organization. Let's say you have visitors who are going to work for you from a time-limited standpoint, and they are feeling not welcome or shepherded into the organization. That would mean that the ambassadors of the organization, the veterans, are not doing their job. They're not kind of being welcoming agents to invite the people in to the organization. The way it might play out in a family is that, let's say there's a family that immigrates from El Salvador and they move to the United States. They have 2 children here. The children that are born here are natives because they're from this country, whereas the parents are visitors because they plan on only being here 5 to 10 years and then going back to El Salvador. But let's say after 5 years of being here, the wife learns English, becomes a special education aide in a public school, and expresses interest in getting a green card. In contrast, her husband has not learned English and speaks longingly of the old country and wants to return there as soon as possible, or at least when he retires. So the task would be to get the family to talk about how they experience this, how they negotiate the different cultural influences. And there's going to be tension because the husband is what we would call a stuck visitor. He's in this no man's land between not being part of this country but not being back in his home country. Whereas the mother is making a clear commitment as a transplant to becoming part of this culture through the ceremony or through the rite of passage of getting a green card. So a question the family might be asking itself is that whose culture are we going to follow? Are we going to incorporate parts of the old country culture and American culture? Are we going to jettison the country of origin culture and embrace wholeheartedly the American culture? Those are questions that needs to be addressed. So let me talk about the application of the theory. The theory can be applied to many different things in an organization. I'll focus on 2 just for now. The first application is in onboarding. Like I mentioned previously, this theory concerns itself with how people join and belong to organizations. So therefore, if you did an analysis or did like a focus group of visitors and ask them what their experience was like, that would give you a sense of how well you're welcoming new people into your organization who are visitors. You also would want to be intentional about who the cultural ambassadors are for your organization in terms of the veterans. Just because someone's a veteran doesn't mean that they're going to be a good cultural ambassador. They have to balance respect and loyalty to the founder and the founder's culture with openness and embracing of the culture of the newcomer, or in our language, the visitor or transplant. Another application it has is with diversity.
So what I really appreciate about this model is that Dylan brought to it a perspective of his background from social work. When I look at it, I see also a model for diversity because it includes all these different ways of not only how people join and belong, but how they identify themselves and how they might be identified by others in the system. So it's a model of diversity that really cuts across traditional or what we might normally think of as diversity, like gender and class and race and things like that. So I think it's a great way to kind of layer in also people's experiences as regards to that. And it's interesting too because it also includes sort of the negative energy and the positive energy and the tasks that people bring, and there's a lot of different ways you can differentiate and slice and dice the model. So I think it could be really useful for people within organizations and also for consultants to use to help people in organizations identify different aspects of belonging and diversity.
Like Ross mentioned earlier, it can be a way of looking at diversity in terms of teams. For example, if you had a team that was made up strictly of veterans, you would be missing out on the contributions of wanderers, visitors, strangers, and transplants. And that would not be a good situation because, we know that theory and research has shown that groups that are made up of, that are diverse, are more effective in decision making and come up with better solutions than homogeneous groups. So, in closing, I'd like to say that this theory is really universal. It speaks to the human experience, the human condition, because we all struggle with how we belong to a neighborhood, a culture, a family, a nation, or a company. So this is a way of kind of understanding how that process works and what people's roles are in the process. Thank you very much.